Right, well, welcome to today's call-in meeting for the Housing and Neighbourhoods Scrutiny Committee. Thank you all for making time in August to come and consider this meeting. We'll do formal things first, and then we will go through the process of listening to the reasons for calling and the response from the executive. Item 1 is the notice of recordings and webcasts. I advise the meeting to note that this meeting will be webcast for live or subsequent broadcast via the Council's meeting YouTube site, and that members of the press public may record and take photos, except when they are confidential or exempt items, in which case I will advise they are confidential or exempt. We do have some apologies. We have an apology from Councillor Marsh Bridle. We have an apology from Councillor Kenwood, and we have an apology from Councillor Deirdre Oldham. I think that's all. Okay. Item 3, declarations of interest. Members are reminded that they must declare all relevant pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests arising from any business to be discussed at this meeting. If a disclosable pecuniary interest is declared, a member must not speak or take part in the agenda item. Any declarations will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. So, moving on to item 4, which is the calling. We are considering the calling that's been brought forward by Councillor Jan and Councillor Hunt, and we will proceed from here. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, at this point I will hand over to Councillor Hunt and Councillor Jan to outline the reasons for their calling and any points they want to make. After that, we will move on to the leader of the council and the relevant officers to respond. Following that, members will be allowed to ask any questions they want to, and then obviously we'll have a discussion about whether we believe the item should be called in or not. Councillor Hunt and Councillor Jan, I'm happy for you to go in whichever order you feel appropriate.
I'll go first because I've looked at this cabinet. Can I just thank you all for gathering into this to look at the concerns raised by this report. There are 4 issues in this report on the Perry-Bar regeneration, which I wanted to bring to your attention, and which to my mind may need some corrections and clarifications in the report. 2 of those issues relate to the Perry-Bar master plan consultation, which was approved by the leader on July the 9th, 3 weeks before this report came to Cabinet. And 2 of those issues relate to the provision of social housing, which I think will be a matter of particular interest to your committee. The issue for us is ward council. We want this new village to be a livable place, somewhere which is a real community, and also to be part of the proposed development of the urban centre in Perry-Bar, so somewhere which is seen as an attractive destination. And the Perry-Bar master plan, which was released for consultation, was a very pleasing document with some innovative ideas. One of those ideas, and this I think is perhaps the biggest issue to resolve, the biggest idea was to retain the Perry-Bar bus garage that is down on this site. And that garage, if you remember, was purchased from National Express and the site around it. So we're not talking entirely of the value of the actual building for about £15 million. Now, the master plan proposes retaining that garage. It's a very interesting, very large building with some historic interest and architectural interest, I understand. And retaining it for community indoor use ideas such as indoor markets, sports activity, and community activity. The indoor market thing in particular is interesting because it's very close to the new wholesale market site. So there's a connection there. Now, we happen to think that's a great idea and would breathe life into the new community. And the leader assures me he thinks the same. The issue in the report is that the word temporary is used twice about this proposal. And in particular, it's used within the frame of the decision making. So the recommendations are to adopt the business case, which is Appendix 1. Within Appendix 1, and you can find this paragraph on page 26, as an example. paper includes funding for the demolition and remediation of the National Express bus depot in line with existing outline planning consent. However, there may be an opportunity to utilise the existing building temporarily as a mixed-use facility. And then it says a demolition would not commence until long-term use of the site has been determined via the master plan. So the intention seems to be there, but the word temporarily creeps in, which potentially undermines the whole consultation, and the master plan undermines and could potentially blight any future use of the garage in the way that's proposed. And the other concern about that, because it is a decision report, and this is a medium-term strategy, so that ultimately it could be an officer making a decision who looks at the wording of the report, not necessarily somebody who's given assurances now about the intentional proposal. So getting the wording right is important. The second master plan issue is around the Hair of the Dog public house. And again, within that business case, it is recommended as option 2 that the site is used for affordable housing. The master plan consultation identifies the Hair of the Dog as a potential heritage asset, which would be a feature on its own within the new community, hopefully retained as a pub. It's not clear what the business case means, whether it means converting that building to affordable housing, i.e. flats, or clearing it and replacing it. But in that option 2, it's put down as a significant necessary move in order to put in more housing for sale on the site. And underlying all this business case, if you haven't read it in details, the £45 million overspend currently on the original budget, partly because of the pandemic, and set against that proposals for £65 million worth of extra, I suppose, is it revenue money for the project from sales through increasing the density of the housing on the site. That then brings us to the social housing issues, because this report also proposes taking out plots 3, 4 and 5, which were 57 ground level houses that were due to be transferred to the Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust. I think that was probably for social housing. And then it seems to be very unclear how that is replaced, in particular how new social housing is provided. And at Cabinet, and the leader wasn't there to clarify, at Cabinet, what the responses to me were not very clear at all. There seemed to be a big confusion between affordable and social housing. Whereas I think we know that the pressing need and the real difficulties in providing that social housing in the city at the moment. And that takes out 57 good quality homes. How will they be replaced? Will they be replaced within the apartment blocks of flats, or what is the proposal? And the fourth one, just to draw your attention, is the proposal for the Oscar Gardens aspect of it, which was considered in a separate paper in Cabinet, but both papers say the same thing, which is that Oscar Gardens would be used for temporary housing for the homeless people, in line with current council policy, but that would only be available for 5 years, and then again that site would be wanted for new housing for clearance, primarily for sale. And the question mark around that is whether 5 years is an arbitrary limit, how long that project will need on that site to work. And again, it wasn't clear to me whether 5 years was arbitrary, and you could end up with a situation where the housing department loses an important provision in 5 years' time, because this report says they've only got it for 5 years. So those are the issues. I don't, Councillor Chan, want to add?
Well said, Councillor Hunt, and I agree with everything that's been said. And yes, same with the bus depot. As we're going to be gaining so many new people, there'll be a new community there. So we need somewhere for this new community. We've got a new school base there as well, and we need to build that rapport with the community. And there's also a theatre on the second floor. so that we can put a coffee shop in there. The residents can have oldie goldie films in there. They can have a family day out. There's so much history to this building, and it'd be a waste to get it knocked down. It's an investment in the area, and so much money is being invested into the area. But why don't we keep history? Because that's important. History is important, and not only that, we can make use of it. There could be a coffee shop where residents can go in, have a coffee, have a chit chat, watch a film if they needed to. We can have an advice bureau there, so at least residents, if they needed any support, we could even have our advice bureau there. There could be a community centre there with activities for families and kids, education. It's endless. So we're looking potentially to say, you know what, let's keep this permanently. Why knock something, as I say, if it's going to work? And the community are excited about this because I've been talking to the community, and it's all about listening to what they want, and then we, as ward councillors, support them. Temporary accommodation in Perry Bar, that's another concern as well. And for up to 5 years. Now, I believe temporary accommodation should be no longer than 7 to 9 months. But however, putting families into shared accommodation, I know we're a shortage of houses, but we need to be creating more social houses in Birmingham rather than putting families in temporary accommodation where they use sharing facilities. Kids already have barriers with what's been going on with COVID and so forth. They don't need to be all living in one floor, and for 5 years, it's going to be a nightmare. So quite a few people have raised their concerns as with that. And we only found out short notice. We had an emergency meeting in regards to Ascot Gardens, and then we were expected to make a decision. And I stated that I can't make a decision just like that unless I've had a site visit, which we've got one tomorrow. And we need to look at how it's going to work. And I'm also going to be looking at other examples of temporary accommodations that have been placed with families in there, and how it's actually working, and how this Ascot Gardens is going to work for the local community. As we said, we've got a big investment coming into Very Bar. We're not ungrateful, we're happy for it, but it's got to work as well.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ward, would you like to start and then bring in your officers as you feel appropriate?
Thank you. Well, let me start by saying that the regeneration that's taking place in this part of Birmingham, ward in particular, that it will impact a much wider area. The catalyst for all of this has been Birmingham's hosting of the Commonwealth Games. Well, we're not doing that. None of this regeneration will be happening. And it's somewhat regrettable and unfortunate that since we won the bid, myself and Councillor John Hunt in particular have been somewhat at loggerheads about the benefits that the Commonwealth Games is bringing to this part of North Birmingham. That's primarily been centred on changes to the highway infrastructure that's taking place as part of facilitating the wider redevelopment of the area. So I'm pleased that we're at a point now where I believe we are going to be in agreement about what is taking place going forward. Because, as I mentioned before this meeting started, I took the opportunity of having a conversation with John at the end of a meeting we both had earlier today, and he ran me through the 4 issues that he's now outlined to be of concern and generated this request for calling. So what I'll do is I'll run through all 4 of them. First of all, the bus depot. I was out in Perry Bar at the village site a few weeks ago and took the opportunity to go and have a look at the bus depot. I agree it is a significant building within the area. The intention, as set out in the master plan that we're currently consulting on, is to create within Perry Bar a place where people would choose to live, where they would choose to work, and where they would choose to visit. And it is that last element where I think bus depot is of importance. I was down in London last week. I went to Covent Garden, went to Borough Market, and you visit those locations in the capital. And you do think that we ought to be able to create something similar here in Birmingham. And I do think the bus depot at Perry Bar gives an opportunity for that. The one side of it is not particularly of architectural merit, in my humble opinion, but the other side of it is a very attractive building. And having had a look inside, I do think there's enough space in there, as Councillor Jan has said, to create a number of different attractions that people would want to go and visit in this particular location. Now, what we're going to need, of course, and this is the reason we are consulting, because we want to get the views of the public. And bear in mind that the master plan is a 40-year vision for this area. So we're particularly keen to engage with young people on the ideas that we push forward. But if we can get an operator who could populate that bus garage with new uses, maybe a market, and John points out the close proximity of the wholesale market, so there's obviously potential there. It could be a restaurant, it could be a theatre, as Janice pointed out, it could be some leisure use within that. We are consulting on all of those at the moment as part of the master plan, and it's very much my intention. If we are going to create a place where people will choose to live and people will choose to visit, you do need an attraction like that that will draw people into the area. So there is no dispute. And the word temporarily that is in the report that's in front of us today is only a reference to the fact that the outline planning consent does give permission for demolition. But let me make it absolutely clear, this is not going to be demolished unless through the consultation, that is what the residents in the area specifically ask us to do, and I think that's extremely unlikely. So if we can come forward with a proposition to make this work as a visitor attraction, that is our intention, and we will be guided by the outcome in the master plan. So there will be no demolition of this building whilst we are consulting, and no demolition of it afterwards if we can make it work as a visitor proposition, and that's what comes through the consultation. So I hope that's reassured you on that issue. Second one is the public house, and the reasons are referenced in the report to possibly, underline the words here, says consider the potential incorporation of the Hereford public house to deliver more units of housing. And the reason that's in there in this report is because at the moment we've not managed to attract either a buyer or an operator who would wish to use that building as public house. And my view, as I discussed with John earlier today, is that if you're going to again create a community where people want to live, a pub is part of that. Tradition in this country, we do have a local pub. This building again has heritage elements to it, but I think it does need to be preserved, whatever we do. If we can find a purchaser or an operator who's willing to run it as a pub, that would be our preferred position. Now, my view is as the residential units become occupied, there'll be more demand for this kind of facility there, so there's a good chance we will find a buyer or an operator to use it as a pub. I'll give you my assurance. If that can be done, that is the preferred position rather than converting it to housing. A restaurant would be another option, I guess, for this building, which would be quite nice. So again, I hope you're reassured by that. Third issue is the amount of social housing, which is where you are focusing your attention. First point to make on this is that the planning consent for the planning application for the village site, so that's the 1,100 homes approximately, the planning consent makes provision for 22% of affordable housing. Now, the Birmingham Development Plan, it has a target of 35% affordable housing across the city as a whole over the period of the plan. Within that 35%, 11% is what is required for social housing. Now, on the site at the moment, what we are looking to do is to accommodate that 22% of affordable housing, all of it, within the development plots that are currently being constructed. So there's an improvement in the density of the affordable units on that site as a whole. We've yet to determine what will happen on the remaining plots, and we've yet to determine what will happen on the second phase and subsequent phases of housing development in this area. What we will ensure happens over those wider phasings, and I think we've been on record as saying this, it's 35%, isn't it? Yeah. We will provide 35% of affordable housing, and we will seek to hit the target of 11% social housing within that. So that is the commitment that we've already given on development of the wider area, or the phases that will follow the first phase. And then the final point was on the former student accommodation, where it's intended to convert that into temporary accommodation. There seems to be a little bit of both ends of the scale here. Councillor John Hunt saying, can we use it for longer than 5 years? Yes, we can. That's part of the consultation on the master plan. If the residents out there are comfortable with this beyond 5 years and there's still a need for it, happy for that to continue to happen. It's certainly better than placing residents who are in need of temporary accommodation into bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast are very expensive. It's also the least beneficial to the residents themselves. So if we need to continue to use this site for temporary accommodation beyond the 5 years, local residents are happy with that. We're happy to do it. And you can answer Councillor Jan, who wants to go and have a look at the site. I encourage you to do that. We think it's entirely appropriate, and certainly, as the Cabinet report indicated, we took through at the last Cabinet meeting. I think the intention is to use this for at least 5 years for temporary accommodation. We'd like to be at a situation where we come up with a better solution for residents than having to put them into temporary accommodation at the end of those 5 years. We don't know that that will be the case. And as I mentioned to John a little bit earlier, it seems to me much more likely in the short term, once the restrictions are taken off by the government, that we're likely to see an increase in demand for temporary accommodation rather than a reduction. So, yeah, on a balance of probabilities, we may well leave this beyond the 5 year period, and we're happy to use it in that way if everybody's comfortable with that use. So I hope that everybody's reassured and we can move forward without the need for this report to go back to Cabinet and me to have to repeat what I've just said.
Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think the only point I would add is the phase 2 outline planning permission does have a requirement for 35% affordable housing within that planning consent. So it's an outline consent, but it meets the BDP policy there for 35%, and the intention there would also be to work that up in detail. We'd certainly be hopeful in phase 2 that there would be, an element of social housing within that as well. And so I would just say on hostile gardens, obviously the rationale was, it's an existing building. To make use of that building in the short term for temporary accommodation, we wouldn't have been able to pull that forward for housing development in the short term anyway. So it's a question of utilising an existing asset. If the master plan and consultation there, it's for the community then to decide about whether that would be a long or short term use. So that's for the community to talk about. And similarly with the bus depot, that's exactly what we're there for. In this consultation, the community come back very positive. Obviously, we'd be delighted to make that work. We think it's a real asset, and it'd be great if that could be a long-term permanent use of the area.
The point Ian's just made on the temporary accommodation explains why it's got this 5 year limit in the report, because on the phasing development across this scheme, that particular site would come forward in 5 years. But as we've both been saying, we're more than happy for that to continue if there is a need.
Questions from members. Councillor Harmer's indicated.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just pick up the affordable stroke social housing point? My perspective on this is that the term affordable housing is in many cases highly misleading, because it is not affordable for people in most desperate housing need, what is created as affordable housing. And that the primary reason, for example, that we have such a huge crisis with exempt accommodation is the root cause of that is that there's not enough social housing, and therefore where do those people go? And the landlords have spotted a loophole in regulations and are exploiting that need and that loophole and creating a crisis that we've got in exempt accommodation. And therefore the real crisis is social housing. And that my first job was in sales, and one of the things we always taught in sales is, watch out for what was described to me by trainer as weasel words, i.e. things that sound great, but if you unpick them, they're not actually a commitment, not actually a promise. So when you say we will hit 35% on affordable housing, and we will seek to hit 11% on social housing, that concerns me, because that sounds to me like a clear promise on the affordable housing, which is the secondary issue really, and we'll do our best, we'll try, we'll go for what is to me is far too low a target anyway on social housing. So I would like to hear a firm commitment, as you've given on the 35%, for the social housing, because that's where the real crisis is in this city.
Can I just respond to that? Because I don't disagree with what's been said, particularly about crisis created by non social housing, which of course is exacerbated by the current government's obsession with right to buy. The development plan, which sets out the need, as it was assessed and the development plan has been put together across the city, identifies 35% of affordable housing. But within that, you can break that need down to around 11% of social housing. Now, what gives us the greatest flexibility on moving forward on this is that we break even on the village side. I'll borrow a time with that. So on the assumption we do that, then in the following phases, just speaking to Ian, as you probably saw, we can get BMHT to deliver 11% of social housing on the remaining phases of the housing development in the area.
And that could be BMHT or another RSL, but there is no reason on phase 2 why the affordable housing target can't be met, and that's 35%, and there needs to be an element of social housing within that. So the 11%, we would seek to do that on phase 2. There's no reason. Well, I'll avoid we will seek, we will do that on phase 2. So obviously that is.
I was going to say, the use of the word we hope to do in social housing. It's all a bit twitchy.
So there's no reason, why 11% isn't achievable on that phase, and whether that's through BMHT or another RSL, the opportunities are there to do that, and the planning policy would require that as well, as is reflected in the current planning consent of those 2.
Yeah, I mean, that probably doesn't need saying, but the concern is that the 35%, if you did it all with affordable housing, that's a cheaper way of doing it. That's more, and therefore, if you hit some problem financially during it, then the fear is that, oh, well, council, we did seek to do that, and we couldn't see any problems why you couldn't do it at this meeting. But X happened, Y happened, and we all know that big projects, things happen. And therefore, well, the only way of making it balanced financially was to convert that social housing into affordable housing, and we still met the thing we have to do, which is the 35%. That's the fear.
No. When you say we have to do 35%, two things are the same, aren't we? We only have to do 35% because that's what's in the BDP, and we have to do 11% for the same reason. That's what's in the BDP. So they're the same things. Overall,
one's easier than the other.
I know one's easier than the other, but they are what's set in the development plan for us to achieve in the period through to 2031. Now, Ian and I can't sit here and absolutely guarantee to you nothing is going to happen over the next few years that might knock this off course. I mean, 2 years ago, we would have predicted the position we're now in, the pandemic. So we can't give an absolute guarantee. I think what we're both saying is we are going to use our best endeavours to ensure that on phase 2, in line with the planning consent, 35% of affordable housing will be delivered, and within that, we'll be looking to BMHT or indeed another social housing provider to provide at least 11% of social housing.
I mean, ultimately, I think what we're saying here is that it's a matter of policy, isn't it? And currently our policy provides for that to happen. If that isn't possible, there's a further discussion that would need to be had at that point, I think is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it's a policy matter. And currently our policy provides for that. Councillor Sharp.
Thanks, Chair. I'm pleased to hear that the lead and hear this saying we are going to get 11% social housing, but it is desperately needed. And I have to say, especially what's happening not far away on the other side of the world, and maybe even needed more desperately when we start having to get people into the city to rehouse them in the future. The other thing, I'm pleased that Penny Bar Garage is going to start, because it brings back a lot of happy memories, doesn't it? Bringing them in times, anyway. And, it would be tragic to actually see it knocked down, because it is a wonderful building. And if you can get somebody who's got the money to put into it, it could be turned into something absolutely fantastic. So I'm pleased to say that happening. Thanks, Chair.
No problem.
The only thing I would add is phase 2 is a vast area. You're talking thousands of homes and significant numbers of development plots, and there is ample opportunity in phase 2 to actually put something bespoke there, where an RSL provider or in Reach or BMHT came forward with a specific scheme to provide that sort of social housing that we all want to see happen. So I would be very surprised if we couldn't make that work. And that's certainly the intention of us all. We want to see the policy delivered. That's the planning permission, and we'll be working to that. So, we want to make phase 2 policy compliant, do everything we can to get there.
I have certainly can. So I'm going to let members finish their questions first, and then I will be giving Councillor Hunt an opportunity to ask anything following. Anybody else want to comment? No. I want to hear about these members' councillors. So we'll leave that till later. Is there anything else you'd like to finally add or add, which isn't technically on the agenda, but I'm quite generous, so.
Thank you.
And then we'll give a final opportunity to the officer, and then we'll make a decision.
Yeah, one last final thing, I'm going to make everyone aware in this room that residents have raised their concerns and have put complaints against planning application for the student accommodation because they said they don't want it, and especially the residents on Muscat Road, they're absolutely fuming. Therefore, there is going to be a lot more coming out in regards to this because residents were appalled that they didn't even get a planning application through their letterbox to say that this is happening on their doorstep. And on Muscat Road, we are already aware there's quite a few supported accommodations on there. So that's just one point. I'm going to let everyone know what's going on that side.
Okay, I am just going to check with Ian if that's all right, if that's part of the master plan or if that's a separate issue because we can't, I completely understand where you're coming from. But what we can't do with Scrutiny is confuse the two issues. You brought a very specific issue for calling, so we need to look at that. But as a wards councillor, do I understand your position? Yes, I do. But obviously planning will have to play itself out through that. But I'm not going to ask the officers to comment. I'm sure they'll speak to you separately about that. But please understand it's just because we can't confuse the process. Is that all right? Okay. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, if I may, just a couple of things. Firstly, broadly, I just wonder, you can obviously decide on yourselves what your process is. I would think it would be quite good if there was maybe something in writing from the leader with those commitments and clarifications, assuming you're not going to call him, because then we have it in writing, as I said.
Decision for us. We have democracy.
I'm not going to, I'm just going back to my original point, the point of the justification for the calling is that the actual decision-making trail within the documents contains words which are misleading, and the clarification might be necessary further down the line. If we have it in writing, it would be very helpful. I just had one question, which was that because the target for social housing is onto phase 2, just if you were to be reminded of what the timescale is for phase 1 and phase 2, because and what the timescale would have been for plots 3, 4, and 5, because there is also the question of urgency around social housing, isn't there? And if phase 2 is quite a few years, it's not actually delivering very much in the near future. And as for the bus garage, yeah, the residents have all been telling us they remember going to film showings there, as Councillor Jan said, an interesting history. You know, it's not, we've not managed to confirm it, but the sort of suggestion is that when it was built in 1932, it was the largest structure of its kind which was unsupported pillars. So I've not managed to confirm that, but quite a few people with knowledge of local history seem to think that's the case. So it would be worth investigation.
Did you want to comment on anything further before we the committee decision?
I can just assure Councillor Hunt, I mean, the intention on plots 3, 4, and 5 is to look at that design and to bring that forward as soon as possible. I think realistically, we're probably looking at construction starting hopefully quite soon after the games there. The other phase 2, there are certainly elements of that which we again like to bring forward sooner rather than later because it is a different offer to what's in the apartments in phase 1 and the extra care. So a large part of phase 2 is now being remediated, as you know, from the site up there, it's largely being cleared. There's still some remediation on parts of phase 2 to go, but if we'll start to look at the detail of that, and again, you know, I see no reason really why we can't start to build homes there, or family housing as soon as possible. So, you know, the intention certainly will be to get the team to work on 3, 4, and 5 quickly, to try and get that underway, and then to open up phase 2 for that second phase as quickly as we can. And I think certainly post 2022 for an early phase there should hopefully be achievable. So we'll be pressing ahead with that now, and you know, getting those family houses built as quickly as possible.
Okay. Happy to confirm in writing what I've said about the 4 issues that we raised.
Okay, Councillor, I'm sure the leader will consider it, but you've already considered it and made a decision, so that's helpful. In which case then, we do need to move on to members making a decision and having a discussion. We have the option to ask officers and Councillor Jan to leave the room. I'm not feeling we particularly need to do that, but I will do if members want me to. No, should we just move to a vote then? All those who think the items have been called in, please What was it you wanted to do?
Just get a quick just on.
No, so I thought you wanted to call the names out.
Sorry, if you raise your hands, I'll just confirm the names for the web stream.
So all those who believe the item should be called in, please raise your hands. All those who think the item shouldn't be called in, raise your hand. Okay, therefore the item won't be called in, but hopefully you did feel satisfied that Scrutiny has done its job and a resolution has been found, albeit possibly before you even got here. But there you go. And Councillor Ward will put that in writing and also send a copy to Scrutiny if possible so we can just track that that's been done. Okay, in which case we've only got a couple of items left, which will take a minute. Any other urgent business? No. Date and time of the next meeting. The next meeting, which is a standard meeting, barring any further callings, will be Thursday, the 23rd of September at 2 o'clock. Any requests or calling for councillors calling for action petitions?
And I just say, Chair, I'm not sure I may be isolating them because I'm away to second operating. So
That's absolutely fine, just let us know now. And authorities, chair officers, okay, thank you all very much for your time, I really appreciate it.
thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.